Today's occurrence happens on Halloween, and it's the worst disaster in Indiana's history. It was Janie White's 13th birthday, and for the past few years, every year, she had asked for the same thing. She wanted to see Holiday on Ice, an ice skating holiday show at Indiana State Fairgrounds. But for the past few years, the answer was always no, because her family didn't have enough money to afford tickets to the show. And now her parents were paying for her older sister's freshman year in college, so even though she still wanted to go this year, she didn't even bother asking. And after they finished dinner as a family at home, Alfred, Janie's dad, asked if she wanted to join him to make a delivery for work. Janie agreed, and Violet, her mom, said she might as well come too since they were both leaving. When they made it to the fairgrounds, Janie suspected they had finally gotten her tickets to the opening night of the ice show. So she said, "You're taking me to the ice show," and Alfred says, "No, I'm not. I have to deliver this motor." So Janie asks, "Where are we going?" And both of her parents have been holding on to the secret since they bought the tickets on the first of the month when they were paid. So he keeps it going and says they're going to the manufacturer's building. And Janie's like, "We've already passed the manufacturer's building." And it wouldn't be until Alfred parked the car that he whipped out the Holiday on Ice show tickets. And for the next few hours, Janie is living her dream and enjoying the fancy costumes, the fairy tale storylines, the flashing lights. There was even an opera number. Her parents were on either side of her, and they were in the 6th row. They were awesome seats, and she was almost happy to have waited for this because her parents saved up to make sure everything was perfect. She was even wearing her new blue and white blouse that her grandma got her for her birthday. But what Janie and her parents didn't know was that they were sitting in the Coliseum's southeastern corner. And on October 31st, in 1963, that was possibly the worst place to be. Because underneath their seats, employees were scrambling to save themselves once they realized they had seconds to react to an impending disaster. And right when Janie opened her mouth and turned to thank her parents for bringing her to the holiday show, the building exploded. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the story of the Indiana State Fairgrounds Coliseum explosion. Holiday on Ice originated in America in 1942. An engineer from Ohio created a portable ice rink and came up with the idea of a traveling show. He took his idea to someone who would finance it and someone who could choreograph and develop the show. A few years after that, the show was able to go as far as Hawaii and eventually started touring internationally all over the world. And it's evolved into something else entirely today, but in 1963, it was very family-friendly and children-focused. So the audience would largely be thousands of children and families. Whenever they came to Indianapolis, Indiana, the Fairground Coliseum was the best, if not only option. It's a multi-use arena and can seat around 7,800 people. And on their opening night in 1963, there were 4,324 people in the audience. Some were even dressed for Halloween. All 4,000 people watched the show start without a hitch and continue the same way. The audience was completely enamored with the final number, a medley called Mardi Gras. There were only 3 minutes left in the entire show. The skaters were moving into a pinwheel formation when a blast of orange fire, 40 feet or 12 meters high, shot up. It went through the south side seats where Janie and her parents were. Concrete and people flew into the air, and concrete chunks of ice, steel, and body parts came down. Most of the audience fell onto the ice on the south side of the arena, and others fell into the 50-foot wide crater from the explosion. People were buried under giant concrete slabs and other people. Janie remembered getting out her thanks to her parents when the first blast hit. Everything shot into the air, a supporting wall came loose, and when Janie came to, she was buried under concrete. A 14-year-old boy was buried underneath her. She looked around and then down at her new shirt, and it was covered in blood. Her gut reaction was fear. Not necessarily because she had blood on her, but because she thought she would get in trouble from ruining her new shirt. Janie reached up to touch her hair and realized it was also soaked in blood, and then followed it to her crown where she found a cut. When she pushed her thumb into the cut, she felt her skull. That's when Janie realized the boy under her was folded over with his torso over his legs in a U shape. She was lying on his back with her feet behind her. The rescuers tried to get the boy out first, but when they pulled him, it pushed Janie into a concrete slab that forced the air out of her lungs. She started screaming that she couldn't breathe, and after they got him out, they went to remove her. But her feet were tangled in rubble, so they couldn't just pull her out. The rescuers spent some time clearing the rubble, and once she was free, they tried to send her to the hospital. But she refused to leave until she found her parents. Now, they did raise her to obey and respect adults, but considering they were missing, she felt like this was the one order she was justified in disobeying. Now, when the explosion happened, responses were immediate. There was already a heavy police presence on site to handle potential Halloween vandals and security issues. So any officer that wasn't injured was busy pulling people from the rubble and moving any loose clothing items like shoes, purses, and jackets. They were also tasked with counting the dead. But at some point after the first explosion, sources vary, anywhere from 3 to 8 minutes, there was a second explosion. Janie didn't feel that one because she was still knocked out from the first. But before police could even begin to do what they were tasked to do, an off-duty fireman beat them to the punch. After the first explosion, which happened just a few minutes after 11 p.m., sources differ on exact times, but the off-duty fireman watching the show in the audience called the dispatcher at fire headquarters within 1 minute of the explosion. The dispatcher answered, "Fire department," and the off-duty fireman replied saying, "The Coliseum just had a big explosion up here, fire and everything." The dispatcher clarified, "The Coliseum?" And the off-duty fireman said, "Well, they had a gas explosion." The dispatcher thanked him for the information, and the fireman ended the call saying, "Get some help." Now, there are 2 dispatchers on duty at all times, and a third man recording calls on what I think was a typing machine. But immediately following the call, a dispatcher hit box 2137, which automatically sent 3 engines, 1 truck, a rescue squad, and the district chief. This was the first group of emergency equipment to be sent to the scene. And just a few minutes after the first call, another off-duty fireman who was in the audience called fire headquarters too. Dispatch told him help was already on the way, but asked for more information on how bad the explosion was. All he had to say to that was, "I don't know how bad it is. I imagine we need some ambulances too." And that second call caused a fire department dispatcher to call Samaritan Hospital and have them send over all 3 of their ambulances to the Coliseum. That was the first notice given to any hospital on what happened. One of the fire dispatchers made sure to follow up with police headquarters to make sure they were aware of the disaster, and that was at 11:11 p.m. Depending on the source, all of that happened within the first 5 to 7 minutes of the first explosion. Now, apparently, fire and police dispatchers monitored each other's calls, because 2 minutes before fire dispatch called to make sure the police were up to speed, a police radio dispatcher called 2 units stationed at a small fire to see how soon they expected to leave. One unit said they would check and let the dispatcher know ASAP, and then come back to say that they expected to be there for a while. At the same time, another unit, called Car 50, heard their discussion and let dispatch know they were near the Coliseum and they would check it out. At this point, the first fire unit made it inside of the Coliseum. It was located near the fairground's main entrance and moved through the massive crowd of people running away, and they started attacking the fire and rescuing people immediately. One firefighter radioed dispatch saying that they needed to send ambulances, doctors, and the gas company. Dispatch let him know that 3 ambulances were already on the way, and the guy is like, "This is a huge mess." Dispatch asks him for an estimate on how many people may be hurt, and he responds like, "I don't even know, maybe 50, 75, maybe 100 people. Dispatch asks him if he knows what caused it, and he lets him know he thinks gas blew up and checks to see if the gas company had been sent yet. Dispatch is like, "No, but we'll send them as soon as possible. What else do you need?" And the dispatcher's voice at this point was trembling. So he tells the dispatch he needs ambulances and doctors, and dispatch lets him know 2 rescue squads were on the way along with the 3 ambulances. And then the fireman ends the exchange by telling dispatch to send as many as he can get. The dispatcher then called the Indianapolis fire chief and the prevention chief, another engine, and a rescue squad to go to the fairgrounds. An emergency unit from the gas company was called too, and fire dispatch called police dispatch to make sure they were aware of the new developments. At 11:15, Car 50 contacted police dispatch with the first police report from where the explosion happened. He said, "There's quite a few injured people up here and there's quite a bit of bedlam. We could use whatever assistance you have." Less than 10 minutes after the explosion, additional police cars were sent to the scene. And as tragic and serious as the situation is, I feel like there's a joke in here somewhere with the firefighters being the first to respond, calling in the explosion to dispatch, being the first on the scene and everything, while the police were probably on scene already, still trying to figure out why everyone was running around. But maybe that's why firefighters get all the love. But I digress. It's a joke. I know people on both sides. Now, fire dispatchers notified the civil defense call list, so those officials were dispatched as well. Civil defense was an effort to protect citizens of a state from human-made or natural disasters. It draws from emergency management, prevention, mitigation, preparation, response, or emergency evacuation and recovery. The programs were implemented in some countries during the 1930s because of the increasing threats of war and bombs. It was created a bit later in the US and was eventually replaced by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, in 1979, which later joined the Department of Homeland Security. But at this point in history, the civil defense existed for exactly this type of disaster. So a civil defense officer heard the police and fire reports and quickly made his way to the disaster site. On his way, he contacted the dispatchers of 3 major crisis organizations and other people to let them know what was going on and that he was on his way to the Coliseum to help. Once the district fire chief made it to the scene, all he could see were huge piles of rubble and heard victims screaming and crying below. He immediately requested that more manpower needed to be dispatched and not necessarily more firefighting equipment. More squads were sent, and the district fire chief also asked for a wrecker, lift, or anything that could get the concrete and steel off of trapped victims. At the exact same time, a telephone pole in one of the shopping centers caught fire, so calls were flooding in for that. Custodial police on duty at the building followed instructions on emergency procedure at the same time because the Coliseum was on state property, so they called Indiana State Police. As far as the Salvation Army and the Red Cross go, they learned of the disaster through information that volunteers in both organizations stumbled upon. A volunteer Red Cross worker was listening to her police radio at home. She heard the reports of the disaster and immediately called the executive director of the chapter. So by 11:10 p.m., they were already ready to go. And that director called a ton of organizations to get them in motion too. The assistant deputy of civil defense called to see what was needed to help and was told that he needed to get a lift from anywhere. So he got one from the park department and had it sent directly to the scene and then informed dispatch that a lift and a wrecker were on the way. He also told them that he was trying to get a hold of more light equipment, like cranes. An engine was sent to fight the telephone pole fire, and when they asked dispatch to get information on the electrical lines there, dispatch told them there were 60,000 volts in the line and to not get it wet. But there's only like 2 actual dispatchers on the phones, right? So they're being overwhelmed with all of this stuff literally happening at the same time. So they told that engine to call the electric company and gave them the emergency phone number to do that. So they're like, "I can't help you. Call this number. Let us know when you're done." So as spontaneous and disastrous as this explosion was, by all appearances, at least at first, it seems as if there's a large response very quickly forming after the explosion. And because it was Halloween night, there were so many extra emergency response personnel on duty to pull from. But when you throw in volunteers wanting to help with buses and station wagons because they heard what happened and called dispatch to see if they could help, dispatch says okay because they're drowning in calls, and very quickly a huge ring of traffic surrounds the fairgrounds. And this was a double-edged sword, because on one hand you have plenty of helping hands ready to assist, but on the other hand, all of the people and vehicles swarming the scene slowed down getting injured people out of there and organizing emergency operations. Like after the first report from Car 50 asking for equipment to help, The police dispatcher immediately sent all available police records to the scene, and other police cars were sent at different times for different purposes. Then civil defense officials called police and fire headquarters to tell them that their office was open and to find whatever they needed to help at the explosion site. And them getting involved gets them the equipment they need, but individual people with wrecking bars, torches, house jacks, and things like that were found and sent to the scene. And then the civil defense county director ordered for boxes of burn dressing at the Red Cross to be sent to the Coliseum. And then that director, feeling good about how organized his staff was, decided to load his wagon with medical supplies and drive to the fairgrounds too. So what that looked like at only 11:20 p.m. to the first civil defense officer who heard the call while driving and decided to head over to the Coliseum was chaos. He made it there and parked by a large open clean area about 50 yards west of the Coliseum called the Cattle Barn, and what he witnessed sitting there was people driving up with everything they brought, parking their cars, jumping out, and running into the Coliseum to help. They left their vehicle in the street, and it's like a domino effect. Once one person does it, everyone starts to do it. So now the road in front of the building is completely blocked off. Car 50 had requested that police cars following after him block off that main gate to the fairgrounds to keep out as many people as possible, but that was ignored. So the civil defense officer watches this happen for about 5 minutes and can't take it anymore, so he takes control of the situation. He got on the PA system on his truck and told the Indiana police officers and State Fairgrounds Traffic Division personnel to get control of traffic around the north side of the cattle barn. Then he told all ambulances and drivers to come to the north entrance of the cattle barn, load up injured people, and leave through the west entrance. So the cattle barn turned into a triage area where victims stayed until someone took them to the hospital. Someone there who was tasked with giving police requests to the dispatcher asked him to broadcast this new system to all police units. So the dispatcher did, and there was also an ask for station wagons over the police and fire radios that multiple commercial TV and radio stations overheard and broadcasted. So this, of course, sent a lot more traffic to the site. There were even multiple funeral homes reaching out to police and fire headquarters, where they were told to send all available ambulances to the Coliseum. Eventually, even city officials were drawn in to help, and the general conclusion for why they had to keep requesting more and more people was that all of these different organizations were not communicating effectively and grossly underreporting the amount of people dead. Like when the Indiana State Police were contacted to send help, they only sent 3 officers because they didn't know how bad it was. The officers were shocked at how large of a disaster took place when they arrived, so they contacted the state police dispatcher, who called the superintendent, and they reported that there were 12 to 15 people dead. This was not even remotely correct, but even still, going off of the number dead rather than the amount of people present when this happened, or even potentially affected, is what kept causing them to have to ask for more and more people across every organization. At 11:35 p.m., the Civil Defense County Director made it to the Coliseum and checked in with the first Civil Defense officer. He told him to continue coordinating and had a doctor assist with interacting with ambulances. At some point, a mobile crane was needed, so the first officer and the county sheriff dispatcher contacted police in one of the suburbs of Indianapolis. The police there were asked to reach out to the owner of the Midwest Heavy Equipment Company to borrow one of their mobile cranes, and within minutes, the crane was on its way to the fairgrounds with the police escort. None of the names or company names used in this story are accurate or true. They are falsified to help conceal identities based on what happens at the end. You'll see. Now, at the same time this is happening, the Indianapolis fire and police dispatchers were also trying to get their hands on a crane, so they made several calls asking for one. And every person they spoke to was told to send cranes to the Coliseum. And the calls for help just kept escalating. Organizations from other towns would catch wind of what happened and contact organizations on scene to see how they could help. Almost every single time, they were told to come help themselves or to send people or equipment to assist them. At one point, they had a hospital open up to take in survivors, and with all of the chaos, an officer on scene requested ambulances be sent to the Coliseum. At the same time, another officer on scene had called to tell them that patients were on their way to the hospital. So, because of the conflicting information, only part of the medical team was sent to the Coliseum. And that exchange somehow led to a county coroner being informed of the disaster, so he made it to the Coliseum around 11:45. And because he beat the rest of the physicians making it there, he was focused on helping the people still alive and hurt under the rubble. Heavy equipment hadn't made it to scene yet, so the victims couldn't be moved. Instead, he focused on identifying information from who he could get responses from and injected them with morphine. Many of the victims had burns so bad, they would later only be able to be identified with dental records. One officer said he couldn't tell if people were male or female because their hair was burnt off and their skin was burnt black. A large drug manufacturer sent doctors and nurses from their regular schedule over to help with 7 trucks, 2 buses, and, of course, medication. It was also around this time that the chief of police, on his way to the explosion site, ran into the first of the police units trying to block off the roads about 4 blocks from the fairgrounds. The officers were struggling to keep the main road open for emergency vehicles when the chief of police and his deputy made it to the Coliseum around 11:50. The civil defense county director immediately suggested to him that a command post be established. The chief of police didn't have any objections to the idea, considering he was just battling his way through a ring of congestion around the fairgrounds. The command post was established by midnight in the administration building across the street from the Coliseum. It was controlled by 5 officials: the Indianapolis chief of police, the director of civil defense, the county sheriff, a representative of Indiana State Police, and the county coroner. Portable radio equipment from police headquarters was set up inside of the command post. Catholic priests were called to the scene to help deliver last rites, so authorities set them up a clergy section inside of the command post so ministers could call next of kin. At this point, most of the injured victims had been removed that didn't require heavy equipment to move them. The district fire chief used a detector gauge to test the air before trying to use acetylene torches to cut out victims under concrete slabs. They heard there was a gas explosion, so they moved with caution to not trigger another one. The air was clear, so they could cut the concrete into slabs, but most of the wreckers that arrived on scene to move the slabs were used for cars. They weren't the kind that could be used to move concrete over trapped people without causing worse injury. It wouldn't be until about 12:50 a.m. when a large portable crane arrived. And at this point, most of the rescue personnel in the Coliseum were mundane because they couldn't do much until the concrete was moved. So the district fire chief asked the deputy police chief to have everyone cleared out of the arena until the rubble was moved. Most injured people were in the hospital by midnight, but some bodies weren't removed from the rubble until way later. In total, 15 to 18 remains were taken from that area. A bit after that, the Chicago fire chief in Illinois called to see if they needed him to rush special concrete cutting equipment on a jet. The jet was fast enough to have what they needed there in an hour, but unfortunately this was obviously too late. While they were digging people out of the rubble, 5 100-pound gas bottles were found. This seemed suspicious, so they were taken to fire department headquarters and guarded by police. By 3 a.m., all rescue personnel had left the blast site, and the Indianapolis fire chief requested a local company come help clean up the mess. The request went out at around 4 a.m., and the cleanup started 2 hours later. The fire chief wouldn't leave the area until 11, 12 hours after the explosion. The assistant chief in the Fire Prevention Bureau stayed back to investigate the cause of the explosion. Now, as they separated the ones who didn't make it from those who survived, they left them on the ice rink because it was the best choice for the morgue. They would cover the remains with blankets, even though they weren't quite long enough to hide some of the more gruesome injuries. Injuries that someone said were the worst thing they had seen since combat in World War II. And during that entire time, Janie White experienced her own nightmare. She remembered a family friend from their church coming to see her, since the woman lived near the fairgrounds. The explosion shook the china out of her cabinet at home, so she came running to see what happened. And she ran into Janie by chance. She also tried to get Janie to go to the hospital, but Janie still refused, so the woman and Janie sat down in a chair in the care of a man loading people onto ambulances. The family friend eventually went inside, most likely to see if there had been any update on her parents. So Janie sat outside and waited. She looked over the scene, the chaos. She looked at every single person who was loaded onto a gurney or who walked out of the building. She hoped and prayed she would see her mom or dad. But eventually, she gave in and agreed to go to the hospital. And the ambulance was so crammed in the back, she had to sit on the passenger seat in the front. When she got to the hospital, doctors poured ice-cold water on her head to help clean the wound, and then she was given stitches. Janie later would say that it felt like they were sewing two pieces of leather together. Since the x-rays didn't show anything being broken, she was free to go home. And at that point, the family friend made it to the hospital to come pick her up. Janie, of course, asked the woman if they had found her parents, and she told her no. Janie spent the night on the woman's living room couch that folded out into a bed. The only reason she was able to sleep at all was because of whatever they gave her at the hospital. The very next morning, a church minister came by to tell her her parents were gone. Now, Janie's sister Annie, who was away at college in Kansas, had been trying to call to wish Janie a happy birthday the night before. But by now, she had heard about the explosion on the radio. And when she couldn't get through the entire night, she tried to call her dad's office the next morning. The secretary at her father's work told her what happened. Their family doctor eventually identified their parents in the morgue inside of the Coliseum, and when he visited Janie later that day, Janie asked him one question. She just had to know if they died instantly, and the doctor told her yes. Now, Janie bawled her eyes out that day, and when her older sister came home from college, they both hugged, but not for too long because Janie's ribs were still very sore. But Janie felt as numb as the sound inside of the Coliseum after the explosion. When the blast first happened, it was quiet, and then there were the screams of those who were in pain. But eventually, by the time first responders arrived on scene, it was eerily quiet. Everyone was in shock. No one really knew how to react to what they just experienced. And Janie would agree that at the time it was all too much to process. And the only thing she had to focus on now were her parents' funeral. How would they be buried? What would her parents be buried in? Who was going to look after her? And where the heck would she live? Luckily, she could stay with that family friend a little while longer. Now, with that entire scenario, there were a lot of redundancies, communication issues, and chaos. Then you have figuring out the cause of the explosion on top of that. The morning after the explosion, the newspaper reported that this was the worst disaster in city and very possibly the entire state of Indiana's history. At that point, they knew at least 65 people were dead, and they expected it to rise, along with hundreds being injured. They quickly figured out what happened. They figured gas leaked from one of the 5 propane tanks in the stadium, and it ran into a heat source and ignited. But as more time passed, more questions arose, because how could this have possibly happened? Reporters started questioning state fire marshals as early as the hours after the blast. They'd ask if it was against code to have liquid gas inside of a public building, to which the state fire marshal would respond and say, yeah, it is. And then the reporters would be like, well, that does mean there's a violation, right? And the fire marshal would say, it at least indicates that. So the tanks were sent to Purdue University for analysis, and on December 4th, 1963, a technical report was released. It specified that liquefied petroleum leaking from one of the tanks was probably what caused the explosion. A 5-week inquiry started before that analysis was released, and 32 witnesses were interviewed, and multiple trips to the site of the disaster were made. The grand jury in the inquiry completed their investigation on December 9th. It was confirmed that liquid petroleum gas was the cause of the explosion, and that it was illegally stored inside the Coliseum. 7 people were indicted, 5 of which were charged with involuntary manslaughter. 3 officials from a Midwest gas company, the general manager of the Indiana Coliseum Corporation, and the concession manager of the Indiana Coliseum Corporation. The state fire marshal and Indiana fire chief were charged for failing to provide proper inspections, which is a misdemeanor offense. The gas company held the most blame because it was supposed to warn its customers of how dangerous improperly installed propane was. Instead, they prioritized profiting off of the sale of those huge tanks instead of considering people's safety. The gas company manager knew and had read several times the state fire regulations prohibiting installing 100-pound gas tanks indoors. And still, he had no objection to the Coliseum's concession manager asking him to install those tanks in the pit underneath audience seating. And what was worse was that the gas company didn't even give training manuals to employees. The Coliseum Corporation was at fault due to its increasing indifference and carelessness with its illegal use of petroleum gas. The state fire marshal's office also received backlash because of the fire marshal only acting in his role instead of actually performing detailed inspections. Inspections that should have been done in the Coliseum before October 31st, especially considering it was one of the largest facilities holding entertainment permits. The fire marshal was also at fault for delaying handing over the tanks to Purdue University to be tested. He actually left them for almost a week in an alley outside of fire headquarters. The grand jury also went after the fire chief because in major cities like this, they're legally required to inspect public buildings, even though the Coliseum is on state property. They went as far as to say, quote, "We do not accept the cries and the protest. No one told us it would do this. If the public is invited into the premises in such numbers as were involved here, we deem it in the absolute duty of the owner or promoter to know and find out what danger is even possible. The State Fair Board in all its numbers must accept their portion of this Holocaust." End quote. The state police also caught some heat for the lack of security that allowed outsiders to get into the Coliseum and tamper with evidence after the explosion. The grand jury made 5 main recommendations that included more control over the use of liquid petroleum gas. It has a good overall safety record, but the desire for profit should never again be desired over public safety in such an egregious manner. They wanted legislation that would require anyone using the arena to request and get an on-site inspection the day of the event, possibly additional inspections during the event too. They wanted the state fire marshal's department completely overhauled from top to bottom. They actually even went as far as to suggest abolishing the department entirely. They also wanted the permit system redone. As it was, it seemed as if once the fee was paid, no one really bothered to do thorough inspections. They wanted inspections to be done by truly qualified and professional men who have tenure and salaries based on keeping up with their abilities and duties. And lastly, they wanted specific fire statutes with specific penalties. They wanted a law that required the owner, manager, or employee anywhere where the public gathers to comply with state fire regulations or be punished appropriately and have it punished as a crime. Now, the chief of the Indiana Fire Department was shook and bamboozled at being indicted because he was charged for failing to inspect the Coliseum for 6 months prior to July 1st. He came out and said he didn't know there was a state fire law that gave chiefs in major Indiana cities inspection responsibilities on state property. And honestly, most city officials were surprised by his indictment too, considering how much praise he received for how quickly his department responded to the explosion. The state fire marshal claimed that he was shocked and denied that he halfway inspected the Fairgrounds Coliseum. He was charged with 2 counts of misdemeanor for not inspecting the Coliseum in a year and for failing to inspect it before issuing the entertainment permit. The governor of Indiana came out and said he didn't believe the state fire marshal being indicted was fair and that the jury used public officials as scapegoats. The county prosecutor wasn't a fan of that statement at all, but a few weeks later, the governor created an evaluation committee to study the fire marshal's office. They were supposed to review the organization and operation of the office and make recommendations. In January of 1964, the committee recommended a bipartisan board be created with power to veto the governor's appointment of a fire marshal. The board would oversee operations of the office and wanted the fire marshal to adopt a merit system of nonpartisan nature and remove it from the present method of political appointments. It was recommended that staff was doubled, the budget was increased for the department, and that the training division was expanded. They wanted a complete review of all state fire laws, codes, and regulations because not all of them were up to standard. As far as actual repercussions go, the gas company officials, along with the Coliseum Corporation manager, and really any of the higher-ups charged with the more severe crimes, had skilled enough attorneys to get their cases dismissed. Even the Indianapolis fire chief's charges were dropped. However, some of the lower-level players that were charged were still indicted. As far as compensation goes, that process was about as chaotic as the disaster response. The State Fair Board was protected from lawsuits because of sovereign immunity, but the Indiana Coliseum Corporation had liability insurance, so people went after them instead. The insurance wasn't enough to compensate the victims, though, and at first everyone thought it was going to be first come, first serve. But a year after the explosion, no legal settlements were made, and only a few victims even received a small amount of funds, and it came from the Red Cross. Sources vary on the exact number, but up to 81 people were killed in the blast and from complications in the years following, and around 400 people were injured. As it was, the last of the 400 injured people wasn't able to go home until October 30th the following year, 365 days and 12 hours after being admitted to the hospital. Other victims had to be readmitted throughout the year from complications. Several of them died. And in the year following the explosion, 150 of the victims brought lawsuits totaling more than $15 million. That's almost $149 million today. Test court cases were heard, but as far as I can tell, the companies were able to drag it out as far as hearings and legislative action goes, to the point where I don't think victims were awarded anything outside of the few that got a couple of dollars from the Red Cross. In the end, there were changes in the communication systems and how departments responded, like the Indiana Police Department, the Fire Department, the Red Cross, and hospitals. Like, apparently at one point, the Samaritan Hospital was contacted and asked to notify other hospitals in the area of what happened so that they could also mobilize ambulances and be ready to take in victims. But the person who was in charge of that at the hospital was overwhelmed by everything else going on there, so they never actually called other hospitals as requested. There were charges within the Civil Defense Organization because even though, yes, that's technically what they're there for, they weren't quite needed when they arrived, and apparently they also shouldn't have just taken over everything. As far as other offices, some decided to actually make changes and others didn't, feeling that their plans in place were fine enough. And despite all of this, after the explosion, the Coliseum stayed closed for 41 days while inspections were made to ensure the building was structurally sound. The public had lost faith in government and many departments, but the Indiana State Fair Board wanted to have the Coliseum hosting public events as soon as possible. So, right around the time the reports and the grand jury findings were released, just 6 weeks after the explosion, the Coliseum hosted its first post-accident event. It was a 2-day cattle show. And in September of the following year, the victims were still in the hospital and dying from complications following the explosion, but the Beatles played in the Coliseum during their 1964 North American tour. It was the first time since the accident that the building was at full crowd capacity. And later that year, Holiday on Ice returned to the Coliseum and performed in front of a crowd of about 5,000 people, which was more than the crowd that had been there the previous year. Some groups didn't mind staying in the Coliseum, but a hockey league based in Indianapolis terminated their lease there and relocated to Cincinnati, Ohio. In the years following the explosion, companies, management, owners, the works, all sold and rebranded up and down the board that had any involvement in the explosion at all. And even though in the many years since this happened, the Coliseum has gone through several multi-million-dollar renovation projects, but it still looks a lot like it did before the explosion. And nothing like this has happened there since. In the end, Janie White had to choose between Virginia or California. If she went to California, she would be the same age as her cousins there, but she knew her uncle in Virginia way better, so after talking to her sister, that's where she decided to go. She eventually went back to Indianapolis during the holidays to clean out the house and get the rest of her belongings, but she would continue to have nightmares for years of an older woman in a pool of blood on the ice. And eventually, her uncle was transferred to the suburbs of Chicago for work. And as much as he and his wife tried to help Janie adjust and enjoy her birthday again, she just couldn't. So eventually, they decided to ship her off to boarding school in Indianapolis. She graduated from there and went to the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. But without her strict parents overseeing her and pushing her, she ended up dropping out and enrolled in Indiana Business College instead. There she met a man who would later become her husband. She would have a daughter, but eventually they would divorce, and she couldn't help but feel like she let her parents down in some way. They had the perfect marriage, and here she was, dropping out of school and now divorced. Most of the rest of her life was affected by that explosion. She had a troubled relationship with her daughter. Therapy helped her realize that she was scared that she would be abandoned by her daughter, just like she was abandoned by her parents. She had to come to terms with the fact that she secretly blamed herself. And while she could never again tolerate the sight of ice inside of a building, she had, as a teenager, gone skating with friends, but only outdoors. If they wanted to go to an indoor arena, she would decline without a second thought. She'd been back once to the Coliseum to watch a friend graduate and stood outside almost the entire time. She stepped inside for just a few moments when the friend's boyfriend came out to tell her that her friend was going to cross the stage. She ran in to watch her friend get her diploma and then ran back out. As time passed, she found the only time she could really enjoy her birthdays was having dinner with family. And even her older sister Annie had to do things differently. She started a new thing where she never called Janie on her birthday. She always waited until the day after. But eventually, years later, the two got together in Indianapolis, and Annie went with Janie inside of the Coliseum. Janie was only able to be in there for just a few minutes, but Annie could tell Janie was at peace when they left. Janie was able to finally go in without running out, crying, in a mess, and showed Annie where her and her parents had been sitting, where she woke up, where she had to wait before going to the hospital, and everything else that happened that day. Stay safe, and see you next week. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.